The morning she drove the first load of straw bales onto that place, it was a Tuesday in late October of 1987, and the sky was the color of old pewter, low and flat, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten you so much as it informs you. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees overnight and come back up to only 34 by the time she got the truck moving, and the gravel roads had that particular stiff quality they get in the last days, before the ground locks for good, still giving a little under the tire, but not much. She had 41 bales on that flatbed, 41 bales of wheat straw she'd bought for $1.75 each from a man 2 townships over who thought she was doing some kind of garden project, some kind of decorative thing with bales stacked around a porch. He didn't ask, she didn't explain. She drove those bales home and stacked them inside a structure that, if I'm being honest about how it looked from the road, did not inspire confidence. It was a sod barn, not a restored one, not a heritage piece with a historical marker nailed beside the door. A working sod barn, 18 feet wide and 32 feet long, with walls nearly 2 feet thick at the base, and a roof that had been relaid twice in the last 20 years with fresh-cut sod over original pine boards, and the whole thing sitting in a shallow draw on the northwest side of a hill like it was trying to disappear into the ground it was made of. Most people who drove past it thought it was a hill with a door. I know because several of them told me so, and they did not mean it as a compliment. My name is not important to this story. What is important is that I was her neighbor, that I had farmed the ground to her east for going on 19 years by that point, and that I was among the people who watched her make that choice and privately thought she had made a serious miscalculation. I want to be honest about that. I watched her stack those bales, and I stood at the fence post by the county road, and I said out loud, to no one in particular, that I did not see how that was going to end well. The sod barn was her grandmother's. The whole farm was, more or less, which is to say, it had been her grandmother's, and before that, her grandmother's mother's, and the line went back that way for a long time on that particular piece of ground, back to a homestead claim filed in the spring of 1894 by a woman named only in the county record as Evos, which stood for Edna, though nobody had called her that in the family's telling of things for the better part of 60 years. They called her the one who stayed. Every other homestead claim filed in that section in the 1890s had been abandoned or sold off by 1910. Edna's had not. The farm was 280 acres, mostly mixed-grass prairie on the uplands, with a creek bottom running diagonally through the south end. And the sod barn sat on the northwest corner where the hill broke and the prevailing wind came from in January. That was not an accident, and I did not understand that yet. The woman who owned it in 1987, I'll call her by what everyone called her, which was just her last initial, V, because that's how she signed things, and that's how she answered the phone when she bothered to answer it. V was 53 years old that October. She had come back to the farm 11 years earlier after a marriage that had run its course in a town 200 miles south, and she had come back with nothing except 2 horses, a stock dog of uncertain lineage, and a composition notebook that had belonged to her grandmother, the one who had built the sod barn in 1903. Not Edna, Edna's daughter, the one they called May. May had built the sod barn in the spring of 1903, using a method she had watched a neighbor use 10 years before that, cutting the sod in blocks 18 inches long and 9 inches wide and 4 inches deep, roots intact, laying them grass-side down the way you lay brick, staggering the joints, and then letting the whole thing settle through one full summer before she wintered any animals inside it. She had written all of this down in a composition notebook, the old kind with the black and white marbled cover and the red spine, and she had written it in a hand that started out careful and grew more compressed and efficient as the pages filled up, the way a person's handwriting gets when they stop thinking of themselves as someone who is writing things down and start thinking of themselves as someone who is recording what works. V had carried that notebook back from her grandmother's cedar chest 11 years before, and she had read it twice through, and then she had done something that I think about now more than I used to. She had put it away, not thrown it away, put it away. In the top drawer of a workbench in the small outbuilding she used as a shop, under a folded piece of canvas, where it sat for the better part of a decade, while she relearned the farm the way you have to relearn a thing you knew as a child and then set down for too long, which is to say slowly and with a certain amount of humility about what you had forgotten. I did not know about the notebook in October of 1987. I did not know what was in it. What I knew was what I could see from my fence line, which was a woman stacking straw bales inside a sod barn while a hard winter was coming on, and I knew what I thought that meant, which was that she was going to lose some cattle. She was running 31 head of mixed black baldy cows that fall, along with 2 bulls and a small group of backgrounded calves she was carrying through to sell in the spring, which put her total head count at somewhere around 48 animals, depending on how you counted the calves that were still on the smaller end of the weight range. That is not a large operation by any measure. The extension office, which had a young man working out of it that year, who wore a clean canvas jacket and drove a 3/4-ton truck that never seemed to accumulate any mud on the running boards, had been through the county that September talking to producers about winter preparation, and his general message, delivered with a certain cheerful certainty, was that the coming winter had a strong probability of being a hard one. The long-range indicators were pointing that way, and producers who were not in a position to supplement their hay supply with additional protein pellets, and who were relying on structures of questionable insulating value, were going to see condition loss and potentially mortality in their herds. He said this at the grain elevator one afternoon in a group of 5 or 6 of us, and I remember that V was standing at the edge of the group with a small paper cup of bad coffee, and she listened to him say it, and she did not say anything in response. He looked at her once, the way you look at someone when you want them to confirm they have received the information, and she looked back at him steadily and then looked at the floor. She bought 2 50-pound bags of mineral supplement and carried them to her truck and drove home. The young man from the extension office watched her go and then turned to the rest of us and made a comment that was polite in its surface but not particularly kind in its implication. Something about how some people were sentimental about old structures, and a couple of the men laughed, and I will say to my discredit that I did not object to the laughter. I did not laugh myself, but I did not object. The diner in town had its own version of V's situation by noon that day, as the diner always did, and the version had grown in the way those versions always grow, so that by the supper hour the story circulating was that she had 40 head going into a dirt barn held up by optimism and old habit, and that the extension man had basically told her she was going to lose half of them, and that she had not even had the sense to look embarrassed about it. None of that was exactly accurate, but none of it was entirely wrong either, and that particular combination is the most durable kind of story in a small town. What none of us knew, standing there at the elevator or sitting at the diner counter, was what V had pulled out of that workbench drawer 3 weeks earlier. She had gone into the shop on a Sunday evening in early October to look for a chisel, which she didn't find, and she had opened the top drawer to check whether it had gotten pushed to the back, and her hand had come down on the folded canvas, and she had stood there in the shop under a single bare bulb with the canvas in her hand for a moment, before she set the chisel question aside entirely and sat down on an overturned feed bucket and opened May's notebook for the 3rd time. She told me this later. She said she sat there for an hour and a half. She said she read the whole thing through again slowly, and when she got to the page she had been thinking about for 11 years without quite letting herself think about it directly, she read it 3 times, and then she sat with it and didn't move for a while. The passage she was reading was near the back of the notebook, written in that compressed and efficient hand, and it said this: The walls hold the warmth of the ground, not of the fire, and that is why the ground warmth is more dependable than any fire. A fire goes out. The ground does not go out. Below the frost line, the earth holds at a temperature that does not punish. The barn is part of the earth. Let it be so. And then below that, in a slightly different pencil, added at a different time, possibly a different winter, straw at the base of the north wall from floor to shoulder height. Not for warmth alone, for the dampness. Straw manages what wood cannot. Below that, underlined once, with a small question mark written beside it in the margin, as if May herself had not been sure whether to trust it. An animal in good flesh going into cold does not need what a thin animal needs. Condition is the insulation. Flesh is the furnace. V had been thinking about that last line, off and on, for 11 years. The thing about the sod barn that the young extension man did not know, and that most of the people at the elevator and the diner did not know, or had not thought about carefully, was what 2 feet of dense, root-bound, thoroughly settled sod actually does to the temperature of an interior space in a plains winter. I want to be precise about this because the precision is the point. In a standard wood frame barn with board siding and a metal roof, the interior temperature on a night when the outside air drops to 15 below zero will follow the outside air down to somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 below inside, maybe colder with wind infiltration, depending on how well the structure is sealed. The animals in that barn are generating heat, yes, but in a wood frame structure with any real volume, the heat they generate bleeds out through the walls as fast as they can make it. You are running a fire that the building is constantly putting out. In a sod barn, properly constructed, properly settled, with walls at the thermal mass that Mays had accumulated over 84 years of continuous use by the time V was stacking straw in October of 1987. The interior temperature on that same 15 below night will sit at somewhere between 12 and 18 degrees above zero, depending on animal density and how well the straw is placed. Not because there is any mechanical heating, not because there is any insulation in the modern sense of that word, because the walls are continuous with the ground, and the ground below the frost line, as May had written down, does not go out. The sod does not release the cold the way lumber releases it, because the sod is not cold in the way lumber is cold. The sod is at ground temperature at its core, which on the northern plains in January is somewhere in the low 40s, and that low 40s core radiates inward, slowly and continuously, the way a cast iron skillet that has been in the oven for an hour radiates heat after you pull it out, steadily and without diminishment, long after a thin pan would have gone cool. I did not know this in October of 1987. I am not sure I could have told you the mechanism even if I had suspected the outcome. What I knew was wood frame barns and propane heaters and straw bedding changed on a schedule, and I thought that was what barns were. V knew something different, or rather, May had known something different, and had written it down, and V had finally, after 11 years, decided to stop thinking about it and start acting on it. The straw she had bought from the man 2 townships over was not bedding. Well, it was bedding, but it was not only bedding. She packed it along the north wall from the floor to a height of about 5 feet, tight against the sod, and she packed a second course along the west wall to about 3 feet, and she left the south and east walls open because the south wall was where the light came in and the east wall was where the door was, and she did not close the door except in the worst of conditions because May had written earlier in the notebook a line that V had memorized without trying to. A barn that cannot breathe will make sick what a cold barn only makes cold. She had her 31 cows and her 2 bulls in that structure, the calves in a small wood frame addition she had built onto the east side 3 years earlier, and she had them on good grass hay twice a day and on the mineral she had bought at the elevator, and she had them because May's last underlined line had been sitting in her head for 11 years, and she had decided to finally respect it in a condition going into winter that I had not seen her herd in before. I want to say this carefully because I do not want to overstate it. They were not fat in a show ring sense. They were not carrying the kind of excessive flesh that creates its own set of problems. They were what an older cattleman I knew used to call properly loaded, which meant that when you ran your hand down the ribs, you felt the ribs, but they were not the first thing you felt. And when you looked at them broadside, the hip bones were there, but they were not knifing out through the hide. They were in the condition that May had described without quite using those words: good flesh going into cold. Condition is the insulation. Flesh is the furnace. V had spent the entire summer of 1987 grazing those animals carefully, rotationally, moving them on a schedule she had worked out by walking the pastures herself in May and counting the standing forage before she put a single animal on it. And the result was that going into October, her cows were carrying roughly 40 to 60 pounds more condition than they had been carrying going into the previous October, which had been a mild winter and which had cost her nothing in losses, but which had also, she would tell me later, told her very little about whether May's method would actually hold. November came in hard that year and then went soft again for 2 weeks, the way November sometimes does on the plains, as if to make you doubt your preparations. And then December arrived and took the softness back and added a penalty for having believed in it. We had our first sustained cold snap in the second week of December, 10 days running where the overnight low did not get above -12, and there were 2 nights in that stretch where the thermometer outside my kitchen window showed -23 at 4 in the morning when I got up to check it. I lost 1 cow in that first cold snap. She was older, 11 years, and she had come into the fall thinner than I wanted her to be, and she went down on the 4th night of the cold, and I found her the next morning. I tell you this not to make myself the example, but because it is relevant to what I was watching from my side of the fence. V. Lost no cattle in that first cold snap. None. I knew this because I saw her at the road on the morning of the 11th day, when the weather finally broke, and I drove my truck to the fence and rolled the window down and asked her how she'd come through it, and she said quietly that she thought they were all right. I asked her if she'd had any heat in the barn, and she said no. I said no heat at all, and she said no, just the straw and the walls and the cattle themselves, and I sat with that for a moment, and then I said that I'd lost one, and she said she was sorry to hear it, and I believed her, and we didn't talk about her barn or her method that morning because there was nothing much to say yet. January was when things separated. January of 1988 began with a week of moderate cold, and then on the 17th, a Tuesday, a front came through from the northwest that dropped the temperature 41 degrees in 6 hours. I remember watching the thermometer fall on my back porch that afternoon and thinking that I had not seen it move that fast since the winter of 1971. By midnight on the 17th, it was -28, with a wind out of the northwest at 22 miles an hour. The wind chill was something I don't want to put a number to because I'm not sure the number fully conveys what it felt like to walk from my house to my barn in that. My propane heater in the main barn, a unit I had put in 3 years before that I had been reasonably proud of, kept the interior at 19 degrees above zero that night, which is not warm but is survivable, and my cattle came through. I went to check on them at 2 in the morning and again at 5, and I was cold enough both times that I was not thinking clearly about much of anything except the task in front of me. V was out in hers at the same hours, I learned later. She had a lantern and her dog, and she walked the barn and looked at every animal, and then she went back inside. She told me later that the interior of the sod barn that night, at the worst of it, held at 14 degrees above zero. Not 14 below, 14 above. On a night when it was 28 below, outside with a wind that would find every gap in a wood frame structure and drive the temperature down through it. 14 above, held by 2-foot sod walls and 5 feet of straw along the north side, and 84 years of thermal mass that had been building in those walls since May had laid the first course of blocks in the spring of 1903. The dog slept inside the barn that night, which V said she had not planned on, but which she also said she did not argue with. She told me that the cattle were quiet. Not the nervous quiet of animals that are cold and conserving, but a settled quiet, a lying down quiet, the kind you get when animals are comfortable and have been fed and are simply being what they are. Condition is the insulation. Flesh is the furnace. By morning on the 18th, the wind had not let up, and it was still -24 at first light, and I drove out to check my fence line on the north side, and I saw V's truck on the road near her lane, and I stopped. She had the windows up and the engine running, and she was sitting there with a thermos, and I pulled up beside her, and she rolled her window down, and I rolled mine down, and I asked her how it was going, and she said fine, she thought. I said any losses, and she said no. I said none, and she said none that she could find. I sat with that. Then I said something that I am somewhat embarrassed about now in its underestimation, which was that she might be getting lucky. She looked at me steadily over the lip of her thermos, and she said she didn't think it was luck exactly. I asked her what it was then, and she said old arithmetic. I didn't know what she meant by that, and she didn't explain, and we both rolled our windows up and drove on, because it was 24 below, and there was work to do. The winter did not relent after that. There was a 3-day break in late January, and then February came in with 2 more hard events, one lasting 9 days and one lasting 6, and the second one included a blizzard that put 14 inches of snow on the ground in 36 hours and reduced visibility to nothing for the better part of 2 days. That blizzard was the event that sorted things out across the county in ways that took the rest of the spring and into summer to fully account. I lost 2 more cows in the blizzard, not to cold directly, but to stress and condition loss, and the kind of cascading failure that happens when animals have been fighting cold for 6 weeks and then get hit with one more serious event before they have had a chance to recover. Both of them were on the thin end of my herd going in, which is something I had known and had told myself I would address in the fall, and had not addressed adequately. I am not proud of that. The final count for my operation that winter was 3 dead cows and significant condition loss across the herd, which translated to delayed breeding dates in the spring, and a calf crop that was lighter than I wanted, and weaned at weights that cost me money when I went to sell. That is not a catastrophic winter by historical standards for this part of the world. That is a normal hard winter, showing you where your preparation was thin. Across the county, the picture was worse. The Extension Office put out a summary in March that I still have somewhere, a single sheet typed and photocopied, that estimated county-wide cattle losses for the preceding winter at an average of 4 to 6% of fall inventory, with some individual operations reporting as high as 11 and 12%. The summary noted that the primary contributing factors were insufficient shelter, inadequate body condition, going into the cold season, and over-reliance on mechanical heating supplementation that in several instances had failed in the most critical stretch of the blizzard due to power interruption or equipment malfunction. Power had gone out in the county for 31 hours during the worst of the blizzard. I had lost power to my barn heater for about 14 of those hours and had kept my animals alive by putting extra bedding down and reducing the volume they were distributed across, but I had been fortunate. 2 operations east of me had not been as fortunate. V had not lost a single animal, not one, the entire winter. She had 31 cows and 2 bulls going in, and 31 cows and 2 bulls standing in March, along with a calf crop that had started arriving in February, which is earlier than most people in this county run their calving, and which meant she had been calving in some of the hardest weather of the winter inside that sod barn, and she had not lost a calf either. She had 31 live cows in March. She had 29 live calves from those cows, two of the cows having not settled in the fall breeding, and she had not lost a single one of those calves in a winter where the county average loss was running at 4 to 6% of fall inventory. I am giving you the numbers because the numbers are what honest accounting looks like, and because anyone can tell a story in which the old way worked better and the modern way failed. And the story is easy to tell in the direction you want it to go without numbers. The numbers make it true or they make it a lie, and these numbers, to my knowledge as a neighbor on that fence line for the decade and a half that followed that winter, were accurate. What she had done was not complicated. That is the thing I want you to hold. It was not complicated. It was 2-foot sod walls that had been in continuous use for 84 years and had accumulated a thermal mass I could not have quantified then, and probably still cannot quantify precisely now. It was 41 bales of wheat straw at $1.75 each, which is $71.75 worth of management, packed against the north wall to a height of 5 feet, to address the dampness that May had noted was the real enemy of a working sod structure in winter, not the cold, but the cold wet, the kind that gets into joints and lungs and does the damage that pure cold alone will not always do. It was 31 cows that had been grazed on a walking rotation all summer because V had counted the forage in May before she put an animal on it, and she had been disciplined about moving them. And as a result, those cows went into October with 40 to 60 pounds more flesh on them than they had carried going into the previous fall. And that flesh had been the furnace May described. No propane, no electricity, no columns of data from an extension office. The ground did not go out. I need to tell you about the notebook more completely because I have been speaking about it in pieces and the full picture of it matters. V showed it to me for the first time in the spring of 1988, in April, after the winter had resolved and she had run her final accounting and she knew what she had come through with. She brought it to the fence line one afternoon, which was not something she did, bring things to the fence line. She usually kept her own counsel on her own side of the wire. She walked over with the notebook in her hand, and I met her at the corner post where the two properties joined, and she handed it to me without saying much. And I stood there in April mud, holding a marbled composition notebook that had been written in carefully and continuously by a woman who had died in 1951, and I read the pages she had it open to. The section she showed me first was the practical section, the measurements and the methods, the block dimensions, and the layering sequence and the settling year, and the notes about breathing and dampness and the straw placement. All of it was in there in May's compressed, efficient hand, worked out over what looked like several winters of observation, revised and corrected in pencil, with numbers scratched out and written over where she had refined her estimates. There was a page near the middle where she had recorded interior temperatures on 18 consecutive nights in January and February of what the date line said was 1919, recording the outside temperature and then the interior temperature of the barn each morning when she went in at first light, and the spread between them ranged from 31 degrees to 44 degrees across those 18 nights, meaning on the coldest nights, the sod barn was running 31 to 44 degrees warmer than the outside air with no mechanical assistance. None. V watched me read that page and she didn't say anything. Then she told me to turn to the last section, the back 20 or so pages, which were different in tone from the practical section. The back section was more like thinking out loud. May had been writing in it over a longer stretch of time, by the look of the pencil changes and the shifts in pressure on the page, and the entries were shorter and less systematic, and more like the kind of notes a person writes at the end of the day when they are tired and thinking about what they have learned rather than recording data for future use. And near the back of this section, on a page that had a small coffee or tea ring in the corner, there were those lines that V had been carrying for 11 years. I read them in the full now, standing at the corner fence post in April mud, and I read the underlined one last, An animal in good flesh going into cold does not need what a thin animal needs. Condition is the insulation. Flesh is the furnace. I stood there with the notebook, and I read it again, and then I handed it back to V. And I said to her that I understood now what she had meant about old arithmetic. She took the notebook back and looked at me for a moment, and then she said something that I've thought about a good deal in the years since. She said, May had known things that the county hadn't gotten to yet. She said it the way you say something that you don't think is remarkable, the way you state a thing that seems to you so obvious it doesn't require emphasis. And then she put the notebook under her arm and walked back across the fence to her side. I stood at that post for a while after she went. The ground was soft under my boots, the way it gets in April when the frost finally runs out of it, and it starts to give again, and the creek in the south end was running hard and brown with snowmelt. And I thought about the fact that the woman who had written those lines in a composition notebook had been working this exact piece of ground, this ground, under my boots and hers, for decades before I had put a single fence post into it, and that she had worked it attentively enough to write down what the walls knew, what the flesh knew, what the ground temperature at 6 feet held at in January, and that she had done this with no equipment beyond a thermometer and a pencil and a willingness to go into the barn at first light for 18 consecutive cold mornings and write down what she found. That is not a small thing. I have had access to soil probes and moisture sensors and satellite-based weather forecasting and a university extension service with full-color printed guides, and I lost 3 cows in a winter that V came through without a single loss, and the difference was a composition notebook and 41 bales of wheat straw and a herd in proper flesh. I'll own that. The field does not care who believes in it. There is something I have not yet told you, which is what happened to the sod barn after that winter. It did not fall. It did not require replacement or significant repair. V continued to use it as her primary winter structure for the next 16 years, through 3 more hard winters and 2 drought years, and 1 spring where the creek flooded the south end of the property badly enough that she had to move the calves to higher ground for a week. The sod barn did not flood. It was on the northwest corner of that hill for a reason that had not been an accident in 1903, and it was still on the northwest corner of that hill for the same reason in 2004. I know because I watched it. I am not telling you that the old way is always right, or that modern methods have nothing to offer. I have used modern methods my entire farming life, and they have served me well in most respects. What I am telling you is that the old way, when it was worked out over decades of careful observation by someone who had no other option but to be attentive, has inside it a precision that can look like stubbornness or sentiment from the outside, and is neither. There was a soil scientist who came through the county in the mid-1990s working on a study connected to the university, doing thermal property assessments on various native soil profiles for reasons that were more academic than practical at the time. He stopped at V's property because someone had told him about the sod barn, and he spent an afternoon there with a probe and a notebook of his own. V let him work and didn't hover. He came back to the fence line at the end of the afternoon with his equipment under his arm, and he was quiet for a moment in the way I had come to recognize as the quiet of a person who has found something they did not expect. And then he said to V that the thermal mass in those walls was, in his word, exceptional. He said he had not seen it in an above-ground structure before, only in underground or earth-sheltered construction, and that the continuous root binding in the original sod, which had had 90-some years to consolidate, had created a density and a conductivity profile that he would not have predicted from a theoretical standpoint. V listened to him say all of this, and then she said that her grandmother had written it was about 31 to 44 degrees above ambient in January. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, that sounded right. That was the whole conversation. He packed his equipment into his truck and drove out the lane, and V went back to what she had been doing, which was mending a gate latch on the south side. That is how May's work got confirmed, not in a ceremony or a publication or a moment of public vindication, but in a quiet afternoon with a probe and a one-word assessment, and a woman who had already known it for 16 years before anyone with credentials showed up to agree. I think about May sometimes when I drive past that northwest corner of the hill. She is not there in any way I can explain, but the barn is still there, still the color of the ground because it is the ground, still with the door on the east side where she put it, and the hill behind it still breaking the northwest wind, the way a hill on that corner was always going to break it, and the whole arrangement still making sense in the way of things that were worked out patiently by a person with no margin for error and no one to consult except the ground itself. She wrote things down. That was her gift to whoever came after her. She watched, and she measured, and she wrote it down in a composition notebook with a marbled cover and a red spine. And she underlined the line she was most sure of, and she put a question mark beside it because she was honest about what she had not yet proven past all doubt. And then she kept farming. Condition is the insulation. Flesh is the furnace. The barn is part of the earth. Let it be so. I have farmed this ground for better than 40 years now, and I have bought expensive things that did not work, and cheap things that did, and I have read recommendations from people with more credentials than I will ever have, and some of those recommendations were right, and some of them were wrong in ways that cost me money I could not spare at the time. And I have stood at a fence post and watched a woman put 41 bales of wheat straw against the wall of a dirt barn before a hard winter, and thought she was making a mistake, and I was wrong. And the ground was right, and May was right, and V was right. To carry that notebook back from her grandmother's cedar chest, even if she wasn't ready to open it for another 11 years after that. You are ready when you are ready. The important thing is that you don't throw it away. That composition notebook still exists, to my knowledge. V is not a young woman anymore, no younger than I am, which is to say, she is not young at all. And whether that notebook stays on her farm or goes somewhere else eventually is not mine to know. But May wrote it down, and that is the thing. She wrote it down, and she meant it for whoever came after, and I think she would be satisfied to know it came through. If you have got something like that on your place, an old structure that looks like stubbornness from the road, a method that made sense to someone who farmed before you did and has not been given its fair test, a notebook in a drawer that you have been almost ready to sit down with for longer than you want to admit, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. That kind of knowledge does not deserve to stay in the drawer. Subscribe if this story meant something to you, and come back, because we move slow on this channel, but I promise you, we get there.